Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. Over many years, the leadership of the Canadian nonprofit sector has been criticized for its lack of diversity. As recently as 2019, the Senate of Canada published Catalyst for Change, a roadmap to a stronger charitable sector. Among its recommendations was a proposed change to amend the Income Tax Act to require charities to report on board diversity when they file their annual T3010. Senator Ratna Omadvar has since proposed Bill S-279 to do just that. Joining us today to discuss the proposed bill and the current state of equity and diversity in Canada's nonprofit leadership is Kate Bahen, Managing Director of Charity Intelligence. Following years of research work in the private sector, Kate began analyzing Canadian charities nearly 20 years ago, looking at their financials and their social impact results for those they serve. Kate sees her role as helping good people give well. Today's views are her personal opinions and not that of Charity Intelligence. Welcome to the podcast, Kate.
Hi, Mary.
Kate, I wonder if you could just start by telling me about the work you do at Charity Intelligence.
So the work I do at Charity Intelligence, I work with the team of research analysts, and we dig into the financials, getting the numbers right, so donors at the click of their fingers have information about Canadian charities, and also going through the charities results reporting. And I think one of the things that this bill identifies is the lack of data. So we're looking at and gathering output data, how many people were helped, how many pounds of food, how many wells built, and also the outcomes, how the charity is making a difference, how it's changing lives. So there's finances and there's also social results. That's what I do day to day, and answer emails from donors.
Well, let's start off with a few of your thoughts around Bill S-279, the bill you just referenced. Do you feel it's a necessary piece of legislation for the sector? Why or why not?
Just off the top, I mean, all of us, in everyone's capacity, I think we need to advance equity and ensure that we address systemic discrimination and racism wherever that is found. This bill, as I see it, is to replicate the bill of large Canadian corporations that are required to report diversity to their stakeholders, to their shareholders. And taking that example, where I believe it's 680 large Canadian corporations now need to report, it's taking that as a model to 86,000 charities. And I'm just not sure. I think we all just need to give it some second thought about data collection. Yes, we absolutely need more data in this charity sector. There is a dearth of data. And one of the lovely comments made was, we know how many chickens there are in Canada, and we know how many eggs they produce. That's the kind of information produced in other sectors. But this bill is looking for data that's getting closer and, to me, a lot more personal. The CRA already has the age of every director. That's already reported. But now the questions are becoming more about your sexual orientation. That is not on the boards right now, but it is proposed. It's one area that may be coming in the future. So I just sort of think before the CRA uses its very extensive muscle to collect data, I'm just a little bit concerned about the sort of types of data they're going to be getting.
So if I understand you, you're concerned that there could be privacy issues in the kinds of disclosures that are going to be required by board members and somehow collected by the organization that's contemplated in Bill S-279. Is that correct?
It's not so much collected at the organizational level, but that it's now part of a national database. And yes, it's going to be by the CRA, and I believe StatsCan has proposed that it can access that data. And we're promised it's all going to be aggregated, and so that individuals won't be identified. But I mean, really, I'm just not comfortable with this direction. When we talk about the number of chickens in Canada and the number of eggs those chickens produce, are we collecting data on chicken farmers? Like, if we're looking at the leadership, do we need to know how chicken farmers identify themselves, their gender orientation, their gender preference? Those types of questions don't really seem to be relevant if you produce a lot of eggs. And I think we should be focused on outputs and outcomes. I think, like, I do vehemently oppose racism. And the events of the summer of 2020, where we saw the police brutality and in the murder of George Floyd, it gave us all a good point of, reflection and a good look at what is happening in Canada. Our biases, our unknown biases, and there has been a lot of movement on equity and inclusion. And I just sort of think, if we're looking at the government's need to act against racism or misogyny, look at the RCMP, look at the armed forces. There have been royal commissions after royal commissions about that. Is the greatest need seriously in the board of directors of 86,000 Canadian charities? I'm not quite so sure about whether that is the problem, because the information that was done by Scotiabank and Imagine Canada in their surveys showed how, in my reading, how large charities and small charities are adopting equity and diversion and inclusiveness with working groups and looking at, what works best. I don't want to be complacent about how far the sector has come. Obviously, we can go much further, but what's the most effective way to go further? What's the evidence-based research show? And rather than this sort of data scoop.
So I guess I'm hearing some concern about the fact that there could be other organizations that could access this data, and it certainly requires a kind of personal disclosures that you don't see in other industries, other than, as you've noted, what was in the changes that required federally regulated corporations to disclose. Am I on the right track of where your concerns are?
Yeah. So in the for-profit legislation of 680 publicly listed companies, they are required to report gender at their board level, their senior management, so CEOs, CFOs, and vice presidents. So looking at the leadership of a public organization along gender, and they had to report things like term limits, whether the board of directors had term limits, and whether they have policies in place for equity, diversity, and inclusion. The bill, as I read it, that's proposed for the charity sector, covers far more organizations, 86,000 registered charities of very different sizes. And some of them, most Canadian charities are very small. And it's asking directors for information that I believe is personal in nature. So it'd be one thing to say, does your charity have term limits? Does your charity have a policy in place for EDI? But asking the sexual orientation of a director is obviously much further than that's been asked in the for-profit sector.
Are you concerned as well that perhaps that Bill S-279 may lead to boards basically checking the box on diversity and so engaging in a form of tokenism rather than focusing on true inclusion?
I think that's probably applicable in every sector, right? Um, and I do hope that it's because all of the evidence-based research shows that organizations, whether they be for-profit or non-profit, where they have diversity, actually have better results. So there's a natural incentive that you want to have diverse views, you want to have diverse leadership, because that will actually improve the performance of your organization. Um, but I have heard from people who themselves have disabilities, and disabilities is one of the categories. Do you have disabilities? That they've been asked to serve on boards. They don't have a lot of time. Serving on a charity board is volunteered, and they're there, and they see themselves as being asked to be on those boards because they have a disability. And I just think, it just puts a lot of it was not well received by, and is it just two people I know who have disabilities who spoke to me about this bill, and they weren't particularly happy with it. They absolutely want equal opportunity. They want to be seen as, members of Canada, citizens of Canada, but they don't want this sort of tokenism.
So, Senator Omidvar, I guess, responds to the issue of privacy invasion that because it's a voluntary requirement, um, it's it's in fact a voluntary disclosure, and rather it's not required by law. It's simply asking the question, and should the individual wish to disclose whether they're a member of any of the equity-seeking groups that are outlined in the bill, that if they disclose it, it should be included in the T30 um, document that diversity, or rather charities, have to annually submit. Do you see that as any kind of defense against this sort of sense of invasion of privacy?
Can I seek clarification? So serving as a director of a charity is a voluntary, therefore you don't need to do it if you but if you do sign up to be a director, then this is just part of the job.
Well, my understanding from her explanation, and we had a discussion about it, is that every person who sits on a board, that disclosure is voluntary on their part, and so um, it's not a requirement for them to disclose should they not wish to disclose, but rather it would be a requirement if this gets passed into law for the organization to actually submit the information that they were able to glean and collect from their members of their boards as it relates to their identity that they wish to disclose.
Yeah, that's it. That's interesting. Um, I just would be concerned what parts of the T3010 are charities required to complete and which ones are voluntary. I think when it comes from the CRA and you have to testify with your signature that this information is truthful, that you haven't skipped any questions. Um, but yes, if it's voluntary, that's fine. Absolutely. And I know now, like with I just sort of the government in Canada has huge powers already. Um, and if it matters to government funding, diversity and inclusion, then every single organization it funds, it can ask as a precondition of its funding, do you have an equity, diversity, and inclusive policy? And if this data is material to the government, then it could request that of the charities it funds. So I just think that there are many alternatives rather than blanketing all 86,000 registered charities in Canada with this legislation. And maybe a sliding scale. Maybe we just focus, just like with the corporations, they just looked at, are you publicly listed? So it wasn't looking at private corporations or family corporations or, mom and pop convenience stores. It was only looking at 680 very large, prominent Canadian corporations. So maybe we do the same in the charity sector with that sliding scale. This is only applicable to charities that receive, over $10 million in annual donations. That are public in that respect, rather than every charity across Canada.
It's an interesting point. I mean, I've spoken to the senator about this issue. About there's been many reports, including one recently that she herself was involved with, that was carried out by Statistics Canada. But her view is that they are voluntary, of course. They so the folks that actually respond to these surveys are actually cognizant of the need for DEI and probably very much in the process of being on their DEI journey themselves to be able to, to have the motivation to take part. And it also only gives a snapshot in time. It doesn't give any data that could be cross country, showing all of the charities across the country providing their data on diversity of their governance. That would be an annual kind of submission so that one could track the progression and the progress of diversity across the governance of charities across the whole sector in Canada. What do you think of that?
I think every data point is a snapshot, right? Every data point is a snapshot. So, so we're going to start tracking this data, and progress would be measured by, do we want proportional representation, or do we want to go over and above so that minorities, racialized minorities, have overrepresentation? I mean, when we talk about progress, what's the goal? There was and there have been robust studies looking at this, and I sort of just keep coming back to, the problem doesn't seem to be in gender from the research done by others. There was a Canadian medical examination, and they looked at the leadership of hospitals and healthcare institutions across Canada. And it was not just the board of directors, it's the leadership, CEOs, and executive teams. I think that's much more important than just the board of directors, looking also at the composition of management. And there it found that women were adequately represented, maybe not exactly to the decimal point of women's representation in the Canadian population. The interesting thing was, one of the biggest gaps was at the ministry level, and how few women were at health ministry levels of leadership compared to at the hospital level. And there was definitely a gap in racial minorities, maybe less so in urban hospitals. But when you're looking at all hospitals across Canada, in more rural areas, there's an underrepresentation by visible minorities. So there's already lots of data out there on race, visible minorities, Aboriginals, and gender. Now we're going into other boxes that I just feel are much more personal.
So, what are donors saying on the issue of board diversity? Should the sector prioritize donors in this regard, or look to what their views are? What have you learned from the programs or the services that you've worked on, or the clients that you've worked with?
Yeah. Donors are much more back to the chicken and eggs questions. Donors are really focused on outputs and outcomes. I have never received a donor question asking me for the gender or the diversity of the charities board. There has been since 2020, I believe, a significant pivot to donors funding First Nations initiatives, a much more awareness brought on by the, Every Child Matters and the incredible reporting on the residential schools, looking hard at Canada's First Nations history and donors looking to contribute significantly to great charities like Inspired, which is, First Nations led, First Nations education. A lot of interest in that area. I just want to raise, and this maybe, it's such a sensitive issue, but we were once one of our top 100 lists or top impact lists of a couple years back. Someone said of the top 10 charities, none of these are BIPOC led. And that actually wasn't true. And when we were doing management interviews with charities with an executive director, we were going through the results and the outcomes and the extraordinary impact they were having. It never crossed my mind to ask the executive director how she defined herself. And she was First Nations, and this was a First Nations-led organization. I was ignorant of that fact. But I was just so impressed by the results at that charity. So and with summer interns at Charity Intelligence, we received in 2024 about $4,000 from the federal government for the summer students grant, and we have 8 interns. And I asked one to volunteer to be the Canada Summers grant student, and he raised his hand. In the information that was asked of him to participate in this funding, yes, he was given the choice. He would rather not tick that box, but still the questions. I just really had hoped. Listen. I'll just go to my personal history. I came to Canada in 1977, and I am so thankful for what this country has given to me. And I came from a country where you tick the boxes to join Girl Guides. Every single thing you sign up for, you tick the boxes. And I'll never forget, my mom asked me when I was 12, what do you see most different about Canada? And I almost whispered, because I just remember feeling so disorientated, like, nobody's asked me to tick the box. And my mom laughed and she says, that's Canada. We don't have to tick the boxes here. And I just was blown away by that attitude, that this country really was that, where you didn't have to tick a box. And so when I see the sort of proposals that we need to tick more boxes, and now there will be new boxes to tick, I just, it's not the way I would like this country to go. I love data, and we need more data in the charity sector, but I just don't want this kind of data.
I guess one of the arguments that I've been hearing for Bill S-279, or legislation that might be influenced by its principles, is that charities, the charitable sector, is basically a public trust, in the sense that they benefit from tax exemptions, and they also get a lot of tax payers' money in the funding that they receive. from our governments. And therefore, given that our society is increasingly becoming more diverse, more with more racialization, more people identifying as LGBTQ plus, more people who identify as having a disability, that the leadership of these charities that are a public trust should reflect the communities that they're serving. What do you say to that argument?
When it comes to public trust, I really wish Canada would pull up its socks. We are so far behind as a country compared to the US, the UK, and Australia when it comes to transparency and accountability. In those countries, and I know it's audited financial statements, but in those countries, if you are a charity, if you are a registered charity, you are a public organization and your financial books are open and they are publicly available on the charity commission or the charity directorate's website. That is quid pro quo. You get that 9-digit number, you get to issue tax receipts, you are open book. It is not so in Canada. In other jurisdictions, in the UK, in 2002, they introduced the regulation standards of reporting. So when you read a British annual report or you look at an Australian annual report of a charity, it isn't fluffy. It isn't pictures. It is solid data and results reporting because that's their regulatory requirement. And without this transparency and accountability in Canada, Canadian donors are at a significant disadvantage in being informed and making intelligent giving decisions. So we have a lot to learn from other jurisdictions, and there is a lot that can be done by the government to improve the public trust in charities. We have to stop the redactions. But yes, I would fully support the government in helping bring about better transparency and accountability so Canadian donors have access to information, as do British, Australian, American donors. Absolutely. I mean, back to the top, all of us in our homes, in our offices, in our places of work, we must all champion equality and diversity and inclusion. No ifs, no buts. And we must all take stands against racism and homophobia and oppression wherever we see it. But the evidence-based research shows the best thing to do is to have these, and I guess it's probably only for larger organizations, but how to move the needle, it's to have these equity diversity groups inside your organization, these working committees. That's what makes your organization more aware, more open, and more progressive. So if the government was to legislate, do you have a working group working on EDI? I'd be 2 thumbs up on that. That's evidence-based. So that's just my opinion.
So this idea of ensuring that, I guess, what gets measured gets done, and that the leadership, the governance of charities should reflect the diverse communities that they serve.
You've also got some issues. Yeah. But I mean, 37, yeah. You've got 86,000 registered charities in Canada, and about 37%, well, 40,000 charities are religious organizations. Some religions don't see women in a leadership position. So is their board of directors meant to reflect the community or their mission? What do you do about some religious organizations and beliefs that don't champion equity and diversity? And when we include their statistics with all of the charity statistics, we're going to see a very different picture from the current survey results done. So it's a hot potato, I guess.
Well, you raised an excellent point, because one of the interviews that I did on this particular issue was a lawyer who's been working in the process of taking this bill forward or supporting it and analyzing it. And he wanted to ensure that I was aware that there is an exemption to um, religious organizations for so that they wouldn't be in a circumstance where they would be required or impliedly required to um, go against their religious beliefs by having representation that wouldn't be consistent with their religious beliefs, I guess, from the get-go, much less report on it. So I don't know how that will
I
come
would
out in the
disagree.
final
Yeah,
draft, but that's what
yeah.
I was told.
I would disagree with that. I think if you are a registered charity, it has to be a level playing field, that some charities of some sectors should not be given exemptions. If you're going to bring in the law, we should all be equal under the law. I fundamentally believe in that principle. So we just need to make sure that we have very good laws. Maybe go to a sliding scale. That would be my first. Let's trial it with the biggest charities in Canada first. Obviously, the charities that are nearly 100% or in some cases 100% funded by the federal government would probably be the best. Eat your own cooking first, right? How are the federally funded charities doing on this metric before moving it across the entire charitable sector?
So I guess I'd like to sort of give you an opportunity, given that you've spent some time thinking about it, to describe whether, in your opinion, there's a better way to do this outside of legislation, such as Bill S-279.
Hmm.
If we agree that the sector needs to do a better job of creating more diverse leadership at the board level or in its senior management, just generally in order to reflect the diversity in our society, is there a better way than what is being proposed?
I don't know. To take a smarter person. Um, legislation, CRA legislation, is an important is a very strong stick, right? Um, I don't know, Mary, on that. Um, it is so hard to judge the contents of a man's heart, right? You just. I also think it's going to be generational. I mean, if you look at the board of directors, most of them, and the CRA already has the age of every single director who serves in Canada. So I'd love to see some of the breakdown of the data the CRA already collects and has collected. Are the boards getting younger of Canadian charities? Like which sectors have the oldest boards and which sectors have the youngest boards? So that's data that the CRA already has on age. I do think it's generational. I know that our generation thinks very differently about, race, sexual orientation, visible minorities than our parents' generation. And I just love I love my children's generation. So I just, I think it was just, I think, we're heading in the right direction. And you look at Canada. I mean, Canada was a leader in the first one to bring in gender identification in 2021. Other countries are still grappling with that so significantly. Racial minorities, I mean, I'm in Toronto in 1981, 14% of Toronto's population was a visible minority. Today, 57% is a visible minority. There's a sea change underway in this country, and I think this country will be better for it. Do we need legislation? I just think we've got enough rules so many times. So many times we have enough good rules on the books. We don't need to bring in new rules. We just need to enforce the rules we've got. That abuse and discrimination cannot be tolerated. And let's use the rules we already have to their full effect.
Kate, do you have any final thoughts you want to leave with our listeners?
I just think that I think the charity sector is diverse, and I think that's one of its strengths. And these last 4 years have been a sea change, I believe, in our reflection of what have we done, where are we today, and where do we want to be going forward. And I do believe data is important. So I think this is an incredibly important conversation to be held at every board table, at every management meeting, at every kitchen table in everyone's families too. Just as an immigrant, I've always been told Canada isn't just a place, it's an ideal. And we're having these conversations, and these are tough conversations, and they're very important conversations to have. So thank you, Mary, for this opportunity.
Well, Kate, thank you so much for your insights and sharing your thoughts on Bill S-279 and, the very complex circumstance that we find ourselves as it relates to EDI in the nonprofit sector and the progress of EDI in the nonprofit's governance. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.